Hello, I hope everyone can hear me. I'm not sure if you'd be able to tell me if you can't, but welcome to Regen's webinar on network charging. Thank you for joining. This is one of the first member webinars that we've done, so I'm hoping at the end of this we'll get some feedback from you on whether you found it useful and whether we should do more of these in the future. So just to introduce myself, I'm Poppy Morphy. I'm the Senior Manager at Regen. I've been working for the last couple of years on network charging, so we thought this was a good time this year, with quite significant decisions being made, to hold a webinar to get our members up to speed with what's going on in Ofgem and around. And I'm going to hand over to the rest of the panel, so Madeline, to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Madeline Greenhalgh. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Manager for Regen. I'm also the Policy Lead for the Electricity Storage Network, so coming from both the renewables and the storage angle.
Hi, I'm Catherine Binnicum. I've spent a number of years in the industry working on both investing in projects and in the development of new solar and storage projects. So I'm interested to discuss how industry can feed into this review and hopefully shape the future charging regime in a positive way.
So we're going to start sharing the slides with you, which means that us as people will be going a little bit smaller, but we are still here. And let's click forward to the start. Okay, so that's who we are. Apologies for the slides being a little bit slow. Just try and get the agenda up.
Sorry, a few technical issues with the slides, but we'll be with you in a sec. There we go.
Okay. This is just a bit of information about our membership. So, like I mentioned before, we're hoping to hold a few more of these webinars for members, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on this one and whether you'd value more and on what topics. So we'll be sending something around after this webinar to talk about that. So onto the agenda. We're going to kick off just with some basics, a quick introduction to what network charging is for those people that struggle a little bit with some of the acronyms and some of the detail. It is relatively basic at a high level, and then when you get into it, it gets very complicated. So we're going to do our best to make it make sense to you. But yeah, there'll be options for questions at the end. Madeline's going to be talking about the targeted charging review in particular, the outcomes and implications of that. I'm going to be talking about the access and forward-looking charges part of the network charging reviews, and then Catherine's going to be talking about sort of giving us an industry perspective and raising some issues that it might, or problems that it might raise for some of the renewable generators. So, to kick off with the basics, so the key question really that Ofgem has been looking into for the last couple of years is how the electricity network is paid for and who pays what. And the context is obviously the energy transition. The network and generation and energy or electricity is happening in a very different way than it was anticipated, and using the network in a different way. And that has had some cost implications. So I thought it would be good to recap just on the perspectives of the different players in this process. The first, most important one really is Ofgem. So they're looking at fairness and cost reflectivity in terms of who is using the network. So this is generation and demand. And their big concern, which sort of kicked off the whole of this review of how the electricity is paid for, was about fairness. And in particular, I think it's about how domestic and commercial and other customers might be using the network. They might be having a lot of behind the meter generation. They might be using it very little, and the less they used it, the less they paid for the network. But what their point is that they feel that doesn't actually reduce the cost of running the network. all it does is mean they pay less towards that, which leaves the leftover people that haven't taken action, or businesses that aren't able to take action, are actually going to be paying more of what is a relatively fixed cost. So that's their big perspective when they're looking at the network charging review. Regen's perspective is a little bit different. We're champions of renewable energy, and particularly decentralized, decarbonised renewable energy. So we're looking at this really from the perspective of how the distributed network and the national network can be set up so it's fit for the future. And we think how that is paid for and who pays for what is really crucial to making sure that that network is in the right state and will develop in the right way. So that's our perspective really on this review. And then the industry perspective is I guess we're talking here about renewable generators, and particularly new renewable generators. They're quite keen on making sure that their business cases stack up, and particularly that the charges are sort of predictable, so people can project out in the future whether something's going to be profitable or not profitable. So it's quite useful just to be aware of that there's quite relatively different perspectives on what people want to get out of the new way that we're going to be paying for the electricity network. And just to say, sorry, we're going to be taking questions at the end, so I'm hoping that's relatively clear. So the next slide is just a quick recap. It's from the Charging Futures website. So if anyone hasn't looked at that, it's quite useful. It gives a sort of overview of the basics. So this is just talking about some of the acronyms that we might be tripping into when we're talking through the slides. And these are the UOS charges, or the use of system charges. And there are three key ones, although there are other charges that come up. I might not talk about those, but we've got the transmission use of charge, which is the TNUOS. We've got balancing services use of system charge, which is the SUOS, and distribution use of system charge, which is DUOS. And the network charging reviews at the moment is particularly looking at distribution networks. It's making inroads into some of the SUOS option transmission, but generally it's looking at the distribution network. And that says on this slide about 8% of the sort of end user bill. Generally, network costs are about 20% in total of an end of user bill. And this just to give the context of the significant code review. So the code is essentially a sort of handbook. Well, I like to think of it as a handbook, although I've never seen it. It's basically saying how you calculate who pays what. So a significant code review is basically a fundamental review of that code methodology on who is charged what. And Ofgem have broken it down into two things. They want to look at the fixed and residual costs. So these are the ones that broadly aren't changing year on year. They're just the cost of running the network as it is. And that's the targeted charging review, which Madeline will talk about a little bit more. And then the second lump of cost and review, so separate significant code review, is about the variable and flexible costs. And that's being looked at in the access and forward-looking charges. And that's in theory the cost of running the network that changes depending on how users are going to use the network now and in the future. So the idea is that that one is the cost where you can send through behavior signals, you can tailor it, whereas the fixed and residual is something that can't really change. And this final slide on the basics is just a rather complicated timetable slide. Sorry about that, but ultimately, this is all leading up to the price control period that starts in 2023. So when the networks start another 5 years of their plans called RIIO-2. And so the idea is that all these significant changes will come into force in 2023. Some of them may start to come in a little bit before that. Essentially, it's all trying to line up with that right price control for the distributed networks. So there's the very quick 101 on network charging. So I'm going to hand over to Madeline now to talk about the targeted charging review.
Thanks, Poppy. So as Poppy mentioned, the TCR is looking at that residual side of the network. So the sunk infrastructure costs that are already paid. So This is it's very separate from the forward-looking review, and as you can see here in the timeline, it's a separate timeline from the forward-looking and access review as well. So we're quite a bit further ahead in the process on targeted charging. We started in 2017 with the review, and we had a Minder 2 decision at the end of last year. So we know, we already knew at the end of last year, end of 2018 actually, sorry, I forgot it was 2020, time moves on. So at the end of 2018, we did get this Minder 2 decision, so we were already fairly certain of what was going to be happening with residual charges. And after we got that decision, I think probably most of you on the webinar will know there's fairly heavy criticism from industry of those decisions that were made, and I'll go into a bit more detail about what those decisions were. But you may have seen some reports coming out from people like Aurora and Oxera looking at the impact that these changes were going to have on renewables and putting that evidence to Ofgem. So after there was quite a lot of discussion, Regen have been heavily involved in looking at the effect on renewables for this and providing evidence to Ofgem, and they did respond to a lot of that criticism with some further analysis. So they did some things on some further analysis on the capacity market, how you apply that fixed residual charge, and they did do some more modelling for renewables. So quite positive, they responded to a lot of our criticism. So just in the middle of that as well, slightly separately, there was a task force that was working in conjunction with the targeted charging review to look at BSUOS, so that balancing service use of system charge. So this was a specific task force to look at how BSUOS would be charged, and that reported in summer 2019. Again, I'll go into some more detail on that in a little bit. And then we did get a final decision at the end of last year. So in November last year, we found out exactly what was going to be happening, and the implementation is going to be 2021-2022. So what was that final decision? There was 167 lovely pages, which you may have already looked through. If not, I'll give you a bit of a summary now. So the main element of that, of the targeted charging review, has been this decision to move to a fixed charge for residual charges. So demand users, instead of paying a variable cost based on their time of use or their capacity, they'll be paying a fixed charge. So for domestic customers, that means that everyone will have one single fixed charging band. This has changed slightly. It was going to be based on some locational factors, but Ofgem have responded to some criticism on that and some questions on how that might be done, and have said no, it will just be one single fixed charging band. For non-domestic customers, there's going to be a banded approach based on voltage, and then that will be further clarified for large consumers based on agreed capacity, and for smaller consumers it will be voltage level plus the net consumption volume. So a slightly different banded approach there, but it's still a fixed charge. We'll see the transmission reforms for that implemented a bit earlier, so they'll come in 2021, and any changes on distribution will come in 2022. So that was the demand side of the targeted charging review. The other side that was looked at through the TCR was embedded benefits. So I'm sure you all know embedded benefits are the payments that distributed generators receive, or not just distributed generators actually, but there are some other charges that transmission used generation and storage receive for basically providing good service to the network. That's changing through many other code modifications as well, but in this one in particular, the targeted charging review has set the transmission generation residuals to zero. So transmission embedded benefits, if you can call them that, so the transmission payments that they were getting in compliance with some EU regulations that have come through has now been set to zero, so those negative payments will no longer happen. And the main one that concerns a lot of our members for both renewables and storage is the balancing service use of system embedded benefit, which was about £2.50 per megawatt hour. That's going to be removed. So that's a £2.50 per megawatt hour loss that we know will happen for embedded generation. There was a proposition in the Minder 2 decision that BSUOS charge would then be charged to generators. Currently they get a benefit and they don't pay, but there's a proposition from Ofgem that they would that they would actually be charged that charge. So that could result in another £2.50 on top of that. So it's quite a big difference for generators and for storage. There hasn't been a decision on that yet. That task force that I mentioned before was looking at how that might happen. They have come out with this orange box here. There's a large report, but this orange box, I think, shows the crux of their decision, is that they couldn't see how if they didn't think it was feasible to charge for SUAS in a more cost-reflective way. So their main conclusion is they don't think that the SUAS should be a forward-looking charge. It should be treated on a cost recovery basis, so on demand users. Now, Ofgem have set up a second task force, so we won't get a decision yet, but that second task force will explore that in more detail, and we'll find out by the summer whether the SUAS will be charged onto generators or not. So, as I mentioned, there were some criticisms from industry on about these changes. So I'll just go into some of those in a bit more detail. On the fixed charge in particular, moving to away from a variable charge means that that incentive to change behaviour disappears. So if you use less, you end up paying more, and if you use more, you'll pay less. So it's not giving you that incentive to use the system in the best way. And then in particular, people with on-site generation that are using that to use the system less at peak times, they also want to have that benefit or be incentivized to use that on-site generation. And just a few figures that you may have already seen before, but just to illustrate how that might happen. This is at a domestic level, and you can see the light green charge is what's currently being paid. The blue charge on the right is the new charge. And as you can see, there's quite a difference as everyone moves to that fixed level. In particular, you're looking at the high electricity users, the electric vehicles, the heat pumps, the economy 7, their charges reduce quite significantly. And if you've got PV or something on your home and you're using less because you've got PV or storage, or your consumption is low, your charge increases. So it does put everyone onto this level playing field, but it means that there are some winners and some losers. And this is a particularly interesting change from the fixed charge. So currently triads, which I'm sure most of you are aware of, costs that people can avoid, quite significant costs when you start getting to an industrial level. So at peak times during the year, if you avoid having demand during those peak times, you can avoid significant costs. So as you can see on the left, the industrial users, those costs are currently at 0. So if you have on-site generation, your cost for triads can be 0. That will change to over £500,000 for some high industrial users. So it's a significant change. But again, it does bring them onto a level playing field with those industrial users without on-site generation. So that's the fixed charge, the impact of that. The embedded benefit changes. It seems quite straightforward what the impact is of that. Basically, if you take away £2.50 per megawatt hour, or potentially even £5 per megawatt hour on renewables, then that's quite a significant part of the business case for renewables and for storage. So a lot of the criticism has been, well, you're putting quite a big cost onto renewables here, and that could delay subsidy for renewables by up to 2 years, is what some of the reports have been saying from people like Aurora and Oxera. So what have Ofgem said about this? Well, they have calculated themselves that they think there will be this change to the embedded benefit will put an extra £1 to £4 billion onto renewables through to 2040. So not an insignificant amount. So that's the cost of making that system fairer. Essentially, the argument from Ofgem is that, well, the charge for charging review is meant to make things fairer. At the moment, embedded benefits are also received by gas peakers and from high emitting fossil fuel generators. So there is an argument that making this level stops those payments being unfairly made to others. And if that does affect renewables negatively, that's up to BEIS to make up that cost. That's up to government to make sure that there are subsidies through the, for example, the contracts for difference mechanism to make up that £1 to £4 billion cost. So Ofgem have taken this into account in their analysis, that they've done their modelling based on the fact that government will pick up that cost. So I think the key takeaway for me from the targeted charging review, this has happened. We know this is coming into force. We know the cost that's going to be had on renewables. But as we go, and Poppy will explain about the forward-looking charging and the access review in a minute, but as we go into that review, we're at a much earlier stage. And I think those issues that we've had with the TCR for renewables perhaps not being considered at an earlier stage as we want to, having those additional costs that we wouldn't have liked to have seen. Let's use that information that we have and make sure that we give Ofgem the right evidence. We get involved and influence at the right time, which is now and over the next 6 months or so, to make sure that the forward-looking charges are balanced in a way that works for renewables and for storage and for decarbonisation.
I think that point on timing is really important, because I think with the targeted charging review, there was a very intense or quite detailed response from industry, but I think by then Ofgem were pretty fixed and entrenched in what they wanted to do. So definitely the sooner the better.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Melon. So I'm going to talk quickly about the forward-looking charges. So just to recap, these are the charges that in theory, the network costs in theory can be changed by how users use the system. And one of the things that we've tried to focus on, because there's so much in these reviews, there's so many different options and opportunities and charges. So we've really tried to focus down on the cost of the new connection. This is because, as our members have told us, and over the last sort of 5-10 years, the distribution network has become more and more constrained for new generation, and so the cost of a new connection is creeped right up in a number of places around the UK. So the reason for this is predominantly because the distribution connection boundary is shallowish, and this means that connectees are going to pay up front for their connection, but also for a proportion of any upgrades or reinforcement that they've triggered on their voltage level and on the voltage level above. So this means that the cost of connections in sort of constrained areas, and this is particularly non-flexible connections, can be relatively prohibitive, to the stage that quite a lot of people would not even attempt to connect a new renewable generator in an area where they know is already constrained. And one of the sort of twin issues to this really is that there are various regulatory barriers between Ofgem and the DNOs that mean that strategic upgrades, so upgrades that are just sort of done by the DNOs that might help to relieve generation constraints, just don't happen. We just haven't really seen those happening. There have been a few small ones that have happened, but generally the constraints stay unless one particular generator is willing to pay a huge upfront cost to get something lifted. And it's worth noting, of course, that this is not the case on a transmission connected site. So the transmission connected site will only pay for their sole use asset, and any reinforcement triggered at that voltage level or above would be paid through socialized network costs. So it wouldn't be, so there'd be less upfront cost and lower upfront cost for transmission generators. So one of the things that Ofgem has actually triggered in this review is to look at that and whether or not that discrepancy between the two voltage levels is causing a problem, and whether they should remove that discrepancy by making the distribution connection boundary shallow or shallower. So the big concern with it at the moment is that if anyone could connect anywhere and anything they liked, there would be really potentially very high costs for users of the network, and that could send bills right up. So one of the sort of good things that Ofgem see with the sort of shallowish system is that it is cost reflective and it sends quite a very strong locational signal. So it's just worth noting that is something they don't necessarily want to lose but maybe they could translate into a charge in a different way, perhaps an ongoing charge rather than an upfront charge. So this is the big area that Regen want to have an impact on. And I just thought this is an Isle of Wight example that was supplied to us by the council there. This is a quote they had for connecting to a battery storage next to a primary substation. And it's worth just remembering, of course, the Isle of Wight is an island, so when we're talking about reinforcement works, we're talking about a subsea interconnector. So it's an expensive piece of network, but it just sort of illustrates the size of these reinforcement works that relatively small generators might have to pay. So their sole connection cost was nearly £1 million, but their reinforcement works were over £3 million, and the connection time was 4 years. And that would apply to any similar sized generation scheme on the island. And it's just a sort of microcosm of this sort of barrier that we think that shallowish charge is putting up across constrained areas of the network. So one of the reasons that we obviously looking at our motivation, it was really about trying to get a system that a network and an energy system that was able to significantly increase the amount of renewable generation. We've got the net zero target. So one of the things, so our views on the problems with this shallow-ish system is that it's unfair on new network users. So Ofgem must have a role to protect the interests of future users as well as existing users. And you may, if you were on the Isle of Wight maybe 20 years ago, you would have got a connection agreement that wouldn't have had a very high cost. But if you're trying to connect now, you'll be paying much higher, and anyone in the future would pay quite high charges. So our feeling is that that's pretty unfair on future users. We also think it sort of encourages economically sort of suboptimal network investment. That is a quote, obviously, that they've received for one generator to put in a subsea cable that would suit their needs. But ultimately, we think network operators should have the opportunity to put in a subsea cable, whatever size they think would meet the need of the whole of the Isle of Wight for the future. And that's not really something they do at this moment. And we also think there's an issue here about considering the full market impact of decarbonisation and these changes. So obviously network cost is something that goes on the bill, and we don't want to see that increasing substantially. But we do think that in the future energy system, electricity market, you're going to have higher network costs, but that will be offset potentially by lower electricity prices due to the fact there are more renewables on the system. So that there shouldn't be a big red flag just because network charges and network costs might go up on an end user's bill, because it may be offset by other things. So those are our current views on why why this shallow charge is something that we're really trying to push. And the good news is that Ofgem are really shortlisting these shallower options, as far as we know, in their option analysis for this year. But they do note it's an effective locational signal. So we think this is an area where there is potential to influence the outcome, essentially. Although Ofgem have asked for more evidence to suggest that this upfront cost is the barrier that we think it is. So this, I guess, part of this webinar is to try and encourage people to submit that evidence to us or to Ofgem, and to sort of engage with that discussion, because at the moment there are options on the table that might really reduce that upfront cost, but it's sort of in the balance ultimately at the moment, and so there's something to influence there. And then yes, the final thing about the access and forward-looking charges that we want to go into today is about the annual cost of connection. So that was talking about the cost of a new connection, but obviously there will be costs or charges on users of the system going forward. And they're looking in the review at putting in all sorts of different options about that access. So at the moment, if you get access, you have, say, a 20 megawatt connection, you can use that how you like, when you like. It's a sort of evergreen, you can have that forever. So they're looking at whether there might be value in having a level of firmness, although we are already seeing contracts with sort of active network management, but a sort of a capped, potentially a capped level of constraint that you could have under a contract with a non-firm connection, which we think would be beneficial. You could have ones where are time profiled or seasonal profiled or continuous. You could have a shared access or individual access, and then you could sort of choose from a menu of access options, and then you would have your bespoke option, your bespoke access option at the end, and then you would pay for however much that would be. I did go to the meeting on Monday. There was a meeting of the challenge group, and just say they were talking through all these different options at that time, and I came away with a massive migraine because there's so many different variables and things to take into account. It's really hard to synthesize all of those, but I've just put in some of the big questions we've got about these different accesses. We think at the moment options are always a good thing, probably, but there's a question about whether the discounts in, if you've got a less firm connection, will the discount be enough to make that a good option for people? I'm thinking about, in a mobile phone contract, do you actually ever go for the one that limits you? And what, how much cheaper would it have to be for you to want to go for that one? How will the options work with the local flexibility markets that the DSOs have been working with at the moment, sort of nascent markets they've been working on? Because ultimately these access options are a form of local flexibility, and then how would those interact, and would that undermine potentially those new DSO markets? And then the sort of rather tricky question at the end of whether you think it's better to have these levied as a sort of volumetric charge, so for each unit you use you pay a certain amount, or whether you would just agree a sort of capacity and they'd be put on an agreed capacity. We can see pluses and minuses with both of those, so it's quite hard to decide on one or the other at the moment. But yeah, those are just some of the questions and issues that will probably be coming up over this year and will be sitting most likely in the consultation that we're expecting to see this summer. Right, so I'm just going to hand over to Catherine. I hope we haven't gone too fast for everyone, but reflections.
Sure. So I think I want to reiterate the point earlier that as someone who was working in the market when we were really adversely impacted by TCI, that was about 5% hit on revenues for some projects. I can't emphasize enough how passionate I feel about industry really taking the time to understand what's being discussed and proposed by Ofgem. And also I think we should remain positive and constructive about what can be done to shape what happens next. And I think probably it's really important to get that feedback into Ofgem now and sooner rather than later, because often what we find is when they'll come out with their formal consultation in the summer, it may well be too late. They may be quite rigid in what their options are at that stage. So I'm going to recap on one particular topic of which I think would be useful for industry to focus on, and we'll move into a more broad Q&A and discussion with everyone on the webinar later, and it'll be good to hear if there's any other points that people are concerned about in terms of what's been discussed. But I think that the proposals on shallower, shallowish or deep charging are probably the most material point in terms of economics of new projects. The grid cost is the biggest single fixed cost that developers have to factor into their business case for projects. And we're in an environment where, in the absence of subsidies for solar and smaller generation and storage, the economics are really tight. So it is important that we have a fair grid charge. So to recap on what Ofgem are talking about, they highlight that for distributed connected projects, the system is different for transmission connected, where the developer would only be paying for the new assets that were specifically needed for their project. What we have on distribution connected projects is a shallowish charge, where not only would the developer have to pay for their own the assets to connect their own project, but also pay some of the costs for the voltage level above, which Regen have a view, but we would be really interested to hear what the industries and what the audience think. That we think that is arguably not fair, because you're paying for potentially other developers who may come along later, and you're effectively paying for a charge which should be socialised more broadly across the network. And then the final definition here is deep, where the developer would pay all of the triggered costs, which we don't think is fair, but that's not reflective of the status quo.
Yes, yeah, and that, although that was an option, I'm pretty sure that's been ruled out. I think they mentioned on Monday that they're not looking at making it any deeper. So I guess that's a positive.
Yes, that's something. But I think it's important that, again, there's any evidence that goes to Ofgem that we all continue to highlight that isn't a sensible option. So from Regen's point of view, what we're really keen to do is to have a discussion with you about whether we're thinking along the right lines. Is it true that the shallower the charges are, the better? And do you have any concerns with that? And perhaps when we go into our Q&A, we can open the floor to discuss that particular topic. One thing that we've started to do is to talk to developers and investors within our network, and we will continue to do so, to look for, really collect a body of data for demonstrating to Ofgem exactly how critical these upfront grid charges can be, and how prohibitive those charges can be to the development of new projects. One point to note, there is a deadline of tomorrow, but we don't think that's realistic, especially having discussed with members. We don't think that's particularly realistic to put together a full set of data, but what Regen intend to do is to respond to Ofgem tomorrow ahead of their deadline to share the general concept and point with them, but also emphasise that we will continue to work with industry to gather additional evidence to demonstrate our points here. One point as well I wanted to draw to everyone's attention, it is that Ofgem have put all of the documentation in one place, and it is relatively easy to navigate, although all of the documentation tends to be incredibly long and incredibly dry, and it's actually very difficult to make the time to read through all of it, but we do urge everyone to read through it, perhaps with the benefit of the summaries we've provided here. But one point I would add is that it's clear that Ofgem have tried to make considered decisions based on evidence, but one thing we noticed that did concern us was that they have started to draw the conclusion that upfront grid costs aren't that prohibitive, because they've got data of grid offers that have been made, and what they've done to answer that question is they've looked at grid offers that have been made, and then they've looked at those offers which have been accepted, and they've said, oh, well, the situation isn't that bad because most people accept the offers that they're made. But the point that we think is really important is that developers will have discarded the project before they even make an application, because remember, it costs money to even make a grid application, and there are material costs involved before you even get to that stage, and I think that's something we need to think about.
And I think I did raise some questions about those numbers because, of course, the shallowish charges also affect demand customers. So if you're a new housing estate or a housing developer, you will have had, you will have paid shallowish charges, and you will probably have gone ahead with those. So what I don't know in the numbers, and I did ask for clarification, is how many of those are actually generation sites and how many of them are actually new housing sites. And the new housing sites are much more likely to have gone ahead with their shallowish charge. Mainly, they'll also be less expensive. I think one of the I guess, overarching concerns with the sort of perspective of cost reflectivity is that if you've built a network, as we have, that based on an old model of generating in the middle and distributing out, anyone operating contrary to how it was originally designed is likely to be triggering more costs on that network than anyone that is, say, a demand off taker at the bottom or a transmission generator at the top. So if you're operating the other way, if you're a distribution generator, you're likely to be costing the network more money. Now, I don't have the evidence to say that, but it sort of feels sort of intrinsically right, and that's where I'm a little bit wary about the idea of cost reflectivity, because you're essentially may well be that just sits on distributed generation because they're working against how the network was designed.
Yes, I think that's a good point, and maybe we should think about, are there ways we can emphasize that fundamental problem, because it's also mentioned in their recent publications. They make what I think is a rather simplistic point. They say, well, we need to have a price signal, and perhaps this is the best it gets. But the point is, if we're thinking about strategically improving the network so that we can meet broader political and public targets for decarbonisation, I don't think that the price signals are fit for purpose, because, as you've said, they will naturally be going against distributed generation, which is intrinsically what we need to get more renewables on the system.
Yes. I think there was some other issues you were going to just quickly talk about.
Yes. So what I'm keen to do is, I guess, give everyone here on the call a chance to raise other kind of real burning issues of concern that they have, so we can discuss them a bit here. We've picked out some of the issues that we think are of the most concern. One of them where we'd be interested perhaps to get technical feedback from those in the industry is around, at this stage, is there value in looking closely at whether the engineering standards and costs that are factored into those grid upgrades are appropriate? It has been mentioned by a couple of people in the industry that perhaps the costing that is being put on grid connection may be higher than necessary if you look at the works that are done in an objective way. So that could be a good area where we could gather objective evidence from the industry. You know, are the kind of grid connection works being overdone or done to a Rolls-Royce standard, and do we need to be having a discussion with the authority about what the reasonable costs are? Another key topic that we think is worth focus is, at the moment, whilst Ofgem recognise that it needs to be there needs to be a differentiation between how small-scale projects and large-scale projects are treated. They don't necessarily differentiate between dispatchable and non-dispatchable technologies, and that's the concern, because you can't. The price signal inherently can't work if you can't switch on and off.
Yeah. So I think that was that's a sort of key question about any forward-looking charge, and the idea that you can influence behaviour in some types of generation. So you can't really, unless you're actually just dumping low carbon electricity or just switching off a solar and wind farm, you can't respond to a price signal at the distribution level at the moment, because there isn't any price signal, but obviously transmission you can be paid to turn off, but this is still different than a gas peaker turning up or down. It's a very different project, and it's a very different field essentially you're playing on, and whether or not it's okay to have that as still on the same level playing field. And I think the last point was about the TNUoS levies. That is another element of the access and forward-looking charge, but we're not going to go into a lot of detail about it here because it's also quite complicated.
Yes, but I think the point is we are willing to take feedback on that, and what we wanted to do was focus on what we felt was urgent and something we could pragmatically shape, which is the upfront grid connections for distribution. But we are keen to engage with you on transmission levies as well.
Yeah. I think it's just worth saying as well that, as Poppy's mentioned, she's on the challenge group. We also Merlin sits on the Smart Systems Forum, which is a high level forum run between BEIS and Ofgem, where these issues come up quite regularly. So there are a lot of opportunities for you to feed into us and then us to feed back to Ofgem, because I realise we've said quite a lot about this is a really big, complex set of reforms. The reason we're here talking to you today is so that we can get your feedback and feed that into Ofgem for you. So as members, if you want to come and talk to us about that, either here or in a different forum, we do have plenty of opportunities to influence Ofgem through those meetings.
Yes, and there is ample time to feed in, because it is complicated and it does need time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're going to open up to questions. We're hoping we'll have some. The way that we're going to do this is if you could, on the webinar technology, there should be an option to raise your hand. We will then unmute you. You will tell us who you are and give us your question or your comment. And if you're not successful, then please keep trying. So I think we're going to see if anyone has actually raised their hand.
So there should be, on your system, there should be an opportunity to just press a hand button and it will show us that you want to ask the question. So, or if not, we do have, you can ask questions by typing them, but we'd rather, if people want to talk, we'd rather talk to you rather than just type at you. So please do, if you've got a question, please do. So just click the hand button and we'll be able to see.
We had a question written. Oh, hang on, we have a hand. Fantastic. We will just try and unmute you. Okay, Sherry, can you hear us? Hello? Oh, doesn't have a microphone. Would you be would you be able to Sherry, would you be able to type your question? Okay, thank you. I tell you, the first question was about the was one from Anna Stegman about what we meant by a shallower boundary. I hope we've answered that question, but ultimately, at the moment, I think we've talked about shallow, which is where you only pay for your sole use assets. Shallowish, you pay for reinforcement at your voltage level and the voltage level above. So a shallower solution would be to pay for reinforcement, for example, only at your voltage level and not for the voltage level above. So one of the things we think is being looked at is whether, although you might not go to a shallow boundary, you might go to a shallower boundary than what is there at the moment. So the question we had from Sherry is about where to send evidence of a project stopped due to grid connection costs. So if you could send that to Regen, that would be great. There is also an email address, which I think I put on one of my slides, that had the address of the Ofgem consultation. So we'll circulate that round at the end of the webinar. So if you want to you can either send it through us or feel free to contact Ofgem directly.
Because I think there is a channel to contact Ofgem directly, so it would be brilliant for members to do that, but I think it's also useful for members to send the same information to Regen, because that can help us to add weight to the argument by putting together a body of information.
Yeah.
Paul, I think Paul's got a question. If you could.
Does Paul have a microphone? That's our question.
We shall see. We'll try and unmute Paul.
So they need to unmute themselves now.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Great.
Hi, it's Paul from Energy for All. I was unable to get onto the webinar right from the beginning, and well, first of all, will the presentation be available?
Yes. Yeah. So we'll send that round after the webinar, along with a little questionnaire. So yes, we'll send that round.
Great. Just a quick question about community projects. The problem with communities has often been they're very owned by the country. They don't, like developers, necessarily have an open cherry pick on the grid where they focus their development activities. So I was just wondering whether there's any consideration by Ofgem for that with communities.
So I think, was that a question about the constrained grid in communities?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yes, there is. I mean, Ofgem have been looking at what to do about community energy projects. Particularly, we know somewhere there's no grid constraints at your voltage level, potentially, or even the one above. But then you start to trigger other reinforcement costs. Sorry, at the voltage level above. So they did look at early on an option about whether you could share, where you could just have access to a local voltage level. That was ruled out, I'm afraid, because that was deemed to be sort of market splitting. But one of the things they did, and they will be taking forward, we think, to shortlisting, is this concept of shared access at a low voltage level. We don't entirely know what that is going to consist of, but the theory is that where, say, a university campus can work behind the meter, they can sort of connect and have their own sort of network, and then have one point of access to the network. That there's potential for community energy groups to have the same sort of system, where they could link up a generator, a demand, or different types of generator at a sort of relatively local level, maybe under a primary substation or something like that, and then pay for one access connection to encourage the local balancing, which I know a lot of community energy groups are keen on. So we're very keen that that option stays on the table. There are challenges to it at the moment, but yeah, that's one of the areas that we'd like to look into a little bit more, actually.
So is that the microgrid idea, and would the community have to adopt the local distribution system, sub-meter?
I guess it's a little bit like a microgrid, but in fact it's sort of trying to avoid duplication of network ultimately. So it hasn't really been explored. So the idea is that you wouldn't need a microgrid. You would connect to the local network, but you would sort of link up your various sources of demand and generation, so they sort of virtually match off each other and balance. So you would pay fewer grid charges because you're sort of balancing locally, if you see what I mean. So that's the idea behind that. So yeah, and then you would need to build a sort of parallel network to the existing network.
So you would adopt the existing wires, the existing network behind the meter point?
Yes, yeah. So you would sort of, it's sort of like a virtual, I think there's a sort of virtual private wire, or a virtual sort of microgrid system is probably what would have to happen. There are challenges to that, and I know that there are some people being quite vocal about not wanting that sort of system, but we're quite keen on it. We think it it opens up a lot of opportunities, and it also sort of it's relatively unfair, I guess, that someone, as long as if you've got land and buildings and like a university campus, you can do one thing, but if you're a small community, you have to do something else. So it's trying to sort of create a level playing field between them. So I think there's quite a good argument for it, but it would be quite, at the moment, I guess the technologies to make that happen are a little bit early stage. Do you have anything to add on that?
No, but I think it is. I think it needs to be emphasised in the evidence that's provided back to Ofgem, because I think that a general theme often is that community projects can face additional barriers with economics for obvious reasons, and that it is necessary to continue emphasising that it can be worth differentiating the arrangements to an extent.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
So there was, is there any more hands out? We've got some written questions that we might take now. Brad, you had a question about the priority of decarbonisation and continuing to lobby them about that. I think maybe, Madeline, do you want to try that one?
Yeah, so you're completely right, Fouad. That's something that we want to prioritise, getting government and Ofgem and Treasury and whoever else to raise that priority of decarbonisation. I think the network charging aspect is a really good example of why Ofgem in particular need to consider decarbonisation more highly than they already do. So we're working at the moment on a strategy for how we best lobby them to do that. So I'll be in touch soon with some specific ideas of how you as members and us as Regen and the electricity storage network can do that over the next year or two. But I think specifically it's finding those areas where we can give tangible examples of why decarbonisation needs to be valued more highly. So network charging is a really good example, and the RIIO-2 incentive process as well, which is currently in its sort of early stages at the moment, and I think that's another area where we're pushing hard for decarbonisation to be considered more highly. So there's plenty of opportunities. We just need to put a strategy in place to actually capitalise on them.
I think it's interesting that the Ofgem is sort of in response to comments so far about what are they going to do about decarbonisation. They said, "Well, we just need to make changes that are right for the consumers, and then it's up to other parties to worry about incentives and subsidies." But the reality is, it doesn't work like that, and we need all of the regulators to work together, really. Otherwise, decarbonisation won't be achieved. Yeah. I know it's a famous saying of Regen that even if Ofgem do only care about the consumers will be in trouble as well if we're all destroyed by climate change.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying as well, just that network charging is an incredibly complex subject that not everyone likes to get involved in, but because it was brought to the attention of the media and politicians quite well over the last year, this has actually been raised in Parliament by several people asking questions. We've prompted a lot of politicians to ask those questions. They held a round table with the head of Ofgem, Martin Cave. So and it has made a difference to Ofgem. Ofgem are much more aware of this problem now. They're mentioning decarbonisation in their strategies a lot more. And maybe it didn't have the outcome we wanted for TCR, but it's certainly much higher on their agenda now. They've redone their analysis because of the things we've told them. So it does work. We just need to keep at it, I think.
We had a question from Amelia. I think you were asking about sharing slides, but I'm hoping your hand means you had another question too. So I'm going to try and unmute Amelia.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. Great. Yeah, I do have another question, kind of following on the same theme, really. One of you said something about how the distributed generation is working against how the network was designed historically, and I was quite intrigued by that, and I think that's quite a powerful reframing, saying that the costs that are being caused by distributed generation are actually there because of the fact that the network was designed for a centralized system rather than because it's kind of inherently costly or something. Anyway, I'd be interested to hear more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it feels intrinsically right, but one of the things that I know that what I'm not able to do is to be able to prove that. And unfortunately, we do need to have the sort of evidence to support that. So I think some of the things, for example, that are starting to raise cost. In fact, one of the drivers behind wanting to charge distributed generation, transmission use of system charges is because we've got some areas of the UK now where the distribution system exports onto the transmission system, and that hadn't happened before. So they're looking at, so that's sort of one of the problems, is that that is seen as a problem. We think this is a great thing. This means that some areas of the country are really generating a lot of electricity, and that they're able to export that around the country. But for the transmission system, this is seen as a driver of cost because their system hasn't been set up really for that. And as far as I understand it, if you'll have a wire that flows better one way than the other, so you'll be able to export a lot less generation than you'll be able to import at a BSP at the moment. So I think there are some points where it is quite clear that that is the case, but it is quite hard to prove without really understanding right down to the sort of detail of the network. So yeah, I also like the point, but I struggle with making it very clear. I mean, what we do think is quite important is to make sure that that level playing field works both ways. So so one of the options that isn't currently on the system is that rather than just that each exporting area of the country, each GSP that's exporting onto the transmission network, should perhaps be treated like a transmission generator or a transmission demand point, and therefore the transmission system could be perhaps better designed to meet the needs of individual areas of the country that have got either a lot of generation or a lot of demand. So yeah, one of the other things that Regen have been looking into, you may have seen the paper, is how regions and cities and local authorities can better influence how their network is developed in their areas. Because, for example, Wales and others, the Welsh government have huge plans for more renewable generation, but at the moment there are huge constraints, and how they can have a better conversation and help develop a better grid that works for each region.
Yes.
So we're very keen on that as an idea.
Thank you.
Do we have any further hands raised? And I think if we don't have any further ones, I might draw that to a close, although I might ask Madeline to give some final thoughts.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, so just to round off, I should say we are putting some feedback to Ofgem, as we said, tomorrow. So please do send feedback to either me or Poppy, and we'll share the slides and our email addresses as well, so that you will know where to come to. But this certainly isn't the end of the story. This is just the beginning of the forward-looking charge and the access review. So there'll be at least another 6 months available for us to talk about this, to get more information, to provide that to Ofgem. And I think that I've said this so many times now, but I think network charging is one of the most complicated things that we do as an industry. It's probably one of my least favourite things. I maybe shouldn't say that, but I completely understand that people can't engage with the reams and reams of complex documents that come out of Ofgem. So we want to know what we can do as Regen and as the electricity storage network to help you understand that better. People don't have time to look through the masses of information that there is. So how can we help you better to understand that? what can we do together as members over the next 6 months or so to understand each other, what the effects of this are on each other, and then how we feed that back to Ofgem in the best way to make sure we don't get the outcome that we had for the TCR.
I think that just emphasises how important it is for members to engage. And I think what I'm taking away is it's, I guess I kind of, with a different hat on, I would include myself as just another person in the industry that wants to get to a good outcome. But my sense is that any level of engagement at this stage, as it's such an early stage, is useful, even if that's questions to Regen, or comments or pieces of evidence that you might feel are small and anecdotal, but I think there is time to put those together into a more cohesive package.
Yeah. I should say there are no stupid questions when it comes to network charging. So if you have any comments, any questions on specifics, we can try and answer them as best we can, or we can get Ofgem to. There are no stupid questions at all.
Great, so thanks everyone for joining, and we will hopefully have more of these in the future on slightly different topics perhaps. So we'd love to hear your feedback about whether this was useful and what else you'd like to hear, and we will circulate slides and keep you in the loop on what we're doing. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.
We'll get there
Eventually we'll quit.
We will be on your screens forever.